Okay.
Alrighty, hi guys. Today, this is our second event, and we are doing Traveling with Psychology, brought to you by Committee 3, which is myself, Mariah Moreno, Ethan Guerrero, Logan Breen, and Debbie. Okay, maybe the slide won't go forward. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the layout of this presentation is going to be that each panelist, which we have two, will have around 15 minutes to present themselves and talk about their experiences traveling with psychology. And then we'll go over each question that members have submitted. And then finally, members will have a chance for open Q&A once all pre-submitted questions have been covered. Presenting our panelists, we have Natasha Richardson. She is a licensed professional counselor. And we have Vanessa McLean. She is a certified national counselor and a clinical trauma professional. And here are questions. Let me bring you this way.
Okay, so we'll be starting it off with our first question. I didn't know if any of the panelists wanted to go in a specific order, but I was just thinking whoever has, the inclination of whoever wants to start that question or whoever wants to divulge in it can. So the first one is, what are some of the less glamorous things about traveling with a psychology degree that people don't talk about?
Well, to give you a little bit more background about myself, I am a counselor, and I received my bachelor's in psychology and sociology, and then I have a master's in counseling and in public health. I have not traveled specifically for psychology in terms of gone to another place to get a specific job within psychology, but I did the Peace Corps. And I also love traveling just in general and love learning about people and cultures and different things to that extent. And so during my Peace Corps experience, it's a little bit different because we're a little sheltered in terms of we have the government assisting us with the systems, right? And so what I would say, though, to answer this question of some of the things that are less glamorous is that isolation. Right. And so being in a space where you may not know the language, where you do not have necessarily your friends or family nearby, where you don't have the comforts of things that you enjoy just on your day-to-day here in your city. Navigating through that isolation can be really difficult. But at the same time, some of the things that I enjoy, which I'll talk about later, is the ability to build relationships within those spaces that you're in, because that helps with those things that are less glamorous, such as that isolation. Another thing that I feel that's not talked about, right, is that sometimes people don't like people from the United States. And so not even in terms of just blatantly being, rude or putting of me ever feeling like I was in an unsafe space, but in terms of making connections, sometimes when people know that you're from the United States, it sometimes is difficult to build those relationships due to things that have been shown, about our country, as well as just the perception sometimes. And so I'll stop there and pass it over to Vanessa, and maybe I'll add a few more things, but those are two of the biggest things that I feel are less glamorous about traveling and working within psychology.
Hi, so let me, for traveling for psychology, I probably have a different perspective because I'm actually originally from South Africa. I was born and raised there. That's where I was trained and licensed as a clinical psychologist. And I worked, and then I worked in the psychiatry department of Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital, which is one of the largest hospitals in the world. And then I moved to the United States in 2002. So it's not that I've traveled and had that cross-cultural experience for a few months. I actually relocated, and besides the initial culture shock, I actually had to assimilate into a new culture. And so probably for me, the least glamorous thing about relocating was the credentialing and the licensing that I had to go through from South Africa to the United States, and then from Virginia to Texas because I moved from Virginia to Texas in 2016.
Yes, and I think that's a very good point that you bring up, Vanessa, because even as I was working as the psychologist within a school, I didn't have any specific credentialing to be able to do that, but that's the position that I was placed in due to my credentials here in the US. But sometimes other countries don't have a system necessarily in place for licensure or for a psychologist position in general, or as a counselor or a therapist. It depends on what country you're in, but sometimes the structure is not there specifically for how to get to that point. And then another thing is sometimes, like here for me, I utilize a lot of resources of nonprofits to, help with coordinating specific needs of clients. And sometimes that system is not in place within other countries, or how to navigate that system is very difficult because it's very isolated to a specific area, or sometimes when you're going through that referral process, it's not as easy. And so that's something else to add.
And it almost feels like you and I may have had reverse experiences, because coming from Africa, where, that was my norm, then coming to the States, which, is a lot more, it's more resources, has a structured system in terms of licensing, although I had to jump through hoops. So interesting reverse experience.
Well, it always keeps you on its feet, it seems like, because you always got to learn through, the different ways and whatnot. So always learning, but we'll be moving on to the next question. What is something you wish you knew before traveling for psychology work? Yeah.
I think going more into the navigation of systems, which is different depending on what culture you're in, or even what country, and even within a country that can differ very vastly in the way that you can navigate utilizing the resources that are available. Even in terms of here in the United States, we have numbers that you can call for specific things. And sometimes in other countries, when doing that, like crisis work, there's not someone to pass them to. There's not necessarily, or there may be, but it may be in like 2 districts over, which traveling to get there may not be possible. And I lived in Peru, and so my experience there too was sometimes when there were more severe challenges in terms of crisis, and you would contact the local police, it was like, oh, just go home, like it'll be okay. Sometimes because they may not have had the capacity to be able to assist in managing those challenges. And so sometimes it's hard to navigate that system. And so I wish I would have known that going in, because then maybe I could have had some ideas of how I could align things, or how to try to create those relationships, or create some type of framework to work within, so that it would be easier to make sure that those particular clients were getting the care that they needed.
Can you send the link in again? I'm so sorry.
I think for me, working, coming from South Africa, which is a multicultural country as it is, but before I moved to the States, I kind of assumed that, I watched American TV, that America would be like American TV. And then, I arrived in Richmond, Virginia, and it was not quite like American TV. So I think, just that realizing that there was a big cultural difference, even though I wouldn't have assumed that because, English is my first language and it was the first language here, and just, having a westernized idea and coming to a westernized country. So I assumed it would be kind of the same. And then I think I also wish I'd known I would have needed a PhD to license as a psychologist in this country. And I think I probably would have pursued that because I did a second master's in South Africa instead. And if I'd known that.
Well, I mean, I guess with the first question too, it's more learning, just the more as you go on, experience-based too. But the third question, what are some difficulties that you faced while working at a place that you may have had a different lifestyle than what you were used to?
I think I'd answer that more based on my experience at Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital, because like I said, South Africa is a multicultural country, and Chris Hani Baragwanath is on the outskirts of Soweto. So I actually worked with the predominantly, the African population who don't have English as a first language. They are not westernized. So, they were coming to the hospital for, medical treatment or mental health treatment, but still they were seeing the witch doctor for bewitchment and things like that. So that was their understanding of mental health problems, not psychologically minded, like, Americans have been kind of taught to think psychologically. So that was probably, that was trying to adapt to that and being able to do therapy with people who didn't have English as a first language, and I didn't understand, and then just the different tribes we have in South Africa. Like there's 11 different tribes, and even between tribes there are cultural differences. So coming to the States, it was much easier because English is a first language. There's an understanding of psychology, and so many people have been in therapy before. So I would say that's the difficulty, is learning how to intuitively just connect with people who see things differently.
I agree, language barriers, because when you have someone who has, it's maybe a very technical conversation that you're navigating, even if you have some knowledge of the language and you're having a more technical conversation, not wanting to miss anything that's key or critical, right? And make sure that it's within the cultural context too. The things that you're saying or the way that you are perceiving a certain situation that may be coming up within session, right? And how the culture perceives this versus how a westernized or from the United States or from my personal background may influence whatever is being presented within that lifestyle, within that culture, because it may be different, but it doesn't mean that it is wrong. And so constantly being aware of that, and even like checking myself like on my own biases, right? And being self-aware of myself, like constantly having to do that is difficult, right? And constantly trying to like reshift the way that you're thinking about a system. For example, like how I was saying, like they don't have these systems in place, of how to pass things along, but they do have a system. It's just different than our system. It's just different than my views. And so trying to constantly be aware of that, it's hard sometimes, especially when you have all this training that you've received within one culture, and then now you're trying to apply that to another. some of the basics, right, of just theories, right, are the same, but everyone, I'm sure on this call, knows that when you're applying those things, it looks very different than what we are learning directly in the book, because they're people and they have individualized things that come up. So I think that's something that's difficult. It's not impossible to manage, but it's difficult to constantly be aware of that as you're working day to day within a culture.
For sure. I agree with that. Especially, I know I have some friends from Mexico. Their parents kind of don't believe in mental health or taking care of their mental health. So it's hard to say, like, I'm going to be majoring in this or being in the field for this when it's something they don't believe in.
Yeah, very true. And even the stigma attached to it, right? Within some cultures, it's like a huge thing where people could be like ostracized for it, or it's like you're an outcast because something's wrong with you. You're crazy because you're going to the psychologist, right? And that's something too, right? Of like just working within, being aware of like that cultural context. And that's something that can happen here in the United States too, right? Not just traveling into another country, but we bring our own, values in every space that we're in, and our own like experiences. And even within you guys working on your psychology degrees, right? You come to every person with your own set of things that, regardless, it's different from theirs. It's different from their family culture. Even if you grew up in the same area or neighborhood, it's different based on what part of like maybe you're in an area that is colder more often, right? Like I live here in San Antonio, but if I go to Colorado, right, the culture is completely different. Or if I go to the East Coast, the culture is completely different. And so that's something to be mindful of, even here within our own country or within our own neighborhoods as you begin to go into the field.
I agree completely. We'll be moving to the next question. How do you best adapt to working with a client from a culture different from your own?
I think that was my first work was with working with people culturally different. So that was how I learned and got experience. So it's hard to put that in words. I think it's a very intuitive thing. And just the way, I know culture has an influence on us, but I think the way I approach people generally as individuals, because even people within the same culture will be influenced differently by culture. Each person has their own way of making sense of their own experience, and sometimes their own personal life story is so much more impacted by their family than it is by the culture. So I really try and just understand an individual as they present, and if they bring up cultural stuff, then that plays a role. But most of the time, it's just getting to understand how people make sense of their own experience, all the different aspects of it.
Yeah, I would say like a few basic principles would be like building relationships, right? Being curious, leave your house, right? Or whatever area you work in, go and observe, like, how are people doing things? Be around, be present, so that you can learn. And it doesn't mean that you're going to understand directly how they are as an individual, like Vanessa was saying, but it will allow you the space to connect, and even just to learn. Also maybe asking like how you can, like if you're going around in that community to learn, asking like how you can help with different things, get involved in so that you can be around people, so that it's not just like this person in my office, but I also am a part of the community. I think those would be like the basic ways that I think would make it easier, and that has helped me to be able to adapt with being in a culture different than my own.
Dan, I'm getting hyped up. I had to mute my mic, but so we'll go on to the next one. Other cities and states have different cultures. How have you ever been confused as to what your client was talking about? And how did you figure it out if you did?
Yeah, for sure. Um, I currently am licensed in 3 states, and during the pandemic, I also saw clients in New York, so 4 different states that are very different. And I just ask, right? It goes back to being curious. You just ask, like, wait, what was that? What does that mean? You know, tell me a little bit more about that. I've never used that term. This is the term that we use in my family or in my household. Even like I speak Spanish, and so there's you know, so many different dialects of Spanish, and so people use very different words that mean very different things, and I'm like, wait, that doesn't, to me, that's not the word that I learned. So what exactly do you mean by that? Tell me how you're using this word. But yeah, you just have to own it and be transparent. Ask questions.
I agree with Natasha. I would ask, but that's really how, I mean, I think how I just work as well, because even people who speak, you know, the same language can use a word and it means something different. So I'm always asking like what something means specifically to someone. And I also, moving from Richmond, Virginia to Texas, I can see that.
Yeah.
You know, it's different. So you're right. Just within just within this country, there's so many different cultural groups based on whether you're up in the cold or down the south where it's warm.
Yeah, I just had a conversation about this earlier, how, well, I've been to northern states and like I greeted people, I didn't really get a response back. And then here I hear people like, good morning, howdy y'all. And it's just a lot different. It's just a whole new world, even just, you know, maybe a couple states away. We'll be going to the next question. What are some cultural differences that surprise you in a good way during traveling for psychology?
Mhm.
It's hard to answer that because, you know, I just I see, you know, cultural differences just as differences. I don't know if it's actually good or bad. So it's hard to answer that.
I agree with you, Vanessa, but I'm trying to think of something that just surprised me in general. Maybe when I was living in Peru, like the emphasis on leisure time coming and like collectivism versus coming from the United States with a lot of individualism and work. And so even in terms of like working with clients and walking through some of those processes of leisure time, and like I think it's a good thing. But here sometimes in the United States, it's like, oh, if you're doing too much leisure time, you're, you know, unproductive or lazy or whatever the case may be, when in reality you're taking care of yourself by doing those things. But yeah, that, and I don't know, that's I think my contribution.
I think in terms of surprise, I suppose one of the things that surprised me is like some of the expressions I grew up using on, you know, and some words for things weren't understood here. So, you know, like we call traffic lights robots. And the one time I mentioned, you know, I got stuck at a robot, and someone looked at me and just like, and then like, what do you mean you were stuck in a robot? So just, you know, some expressions that I've used that I've had to learn in the, you know, the last sort of 19 years I've been in the States, not to use it because no one understands what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm trying to think of something else. That's all I have for that one.
I kind of want to start saying robots now for traffic lights. The next question.
I could give you an even funnier one. Another word like we use for calling is tinkle. And one day, my husband at work, someone left him a voicemail and he called him back and said, "I'll give you a tinkle later." And
That's
she was
pretty
like,
funny.
what do you mean? So we don't say that anymore.
I was just thinking, I work in an apartment complex, but we have to leave voicemails. And if they said, "Hey, just give me a tinkle back," the next question is it expensive to travel for psychology, or are there many opportunities to do at a low cost?
It's hard for me to speak to that one because, I didn't travel as a student. I was already, I was working full time. I was married. My husband came over here for work and he was working full time. So it's hard to answer that. Travel in general is expensive. So I'm not sure how you could do it at a low cost, but I don't know, maybe Natasha has more to say to that.
Yeah, I travel a lot and I'm a budget traveler just in general. And so I am more about the experience than like the luxury. And in terms of work, there's so many different programs that are out there to do volunteer work that can, like paid volunteer work, turn into securing a job, a country, within a field, within a certain space, because you have the pre-volunteer experience that helps you to create those networks. For example, with the Peace Corps, we only got paid $300 a month. So that's not a lot of money, but when you think of it in terms of like the cost of living, we were getting paid a lot in comparison to the average household income, right? And then even more so on top of that, because I did have like other things that I had to pay and here, right, to maintain different things. I just saved money, and I, ate where, instead of eating at like, whatever luxury place, or like a McDonald's is not luxury, but the prices were higher than eating a local lunch food, right? It just depends on how you are as a person and what your needs are. For me, it is not very difficult. In terms of work, I think that you can look and research. There's plenty of opportunities out there. Even for the Peace Corps, for example, you're there for 27 plus months, right? Which is almost 2.5 years. And so you should be able to build a pretty hefty network if you want to be able to make connections to find a position. As I said, I was the psychologist at this campus. I could have easily navigated some systems to secure that as a permanent position, or even to move over to do something at like one of the schools, or the education board or something, the health board of some sort, utilizing my skills in that way. It's just dependent on how you are as a person, but I think that there's ways to make it less expensive.
Well, I'm all about saving, especially on a budget as a college student. Teach me those ways.
Yes, if anybody wants help with traveling on a budget, I'll put my email and we can talk it through, because it's something that I'm very passionate about, as well as like giving, when you're in a country and you are contributing to local businesses versus big businesses is very different. And so if you're living similarly to the way that local people are living within that country, it may not be as expensive.
Gotcha. Sounds good. Have you ever noticed yourself being biased when working with a client from another culture?
Yes, short answer. Back to what I was discussing earlier in terms of, you know, what my individual culture is and what I believe to be true about the world around me can always be different from any other person, right? And so one of the things that's most important is being aware of that, right? Being self-aware of what some of your biases are, and when that's coming up, checking yourself of whether, you know, like this belief or this projecting this on, and to project my thoughts and what I find is true to make it something that they should also find as true, as well as like, how does this bias of mine impact that safety or health of the person that I'm working with, right? Am I trying to have them navigate something the way that I would when that's not what's best for them?
I mean, I think we all have, you know, the way our brain works is how, you know, we categorize everything for efficiency. So I think we all do that. I think, you know, like Natasha said, kind of being aware, but I think growing up in a country that was so multicultural, it was just kind of that is how people are. They're different. And I think South Africa, the education there is, you know, you get such a global education, so you always know that other places are different. So I don't think it's ever really a shock when people are different for me. So, but obviously we all have these ideas, you know, and these stereotypes because our brain likes to categorize for, you know, efficiency of information processing.
I've been trying to practice staying away from biases just by hearing from both sides. I remember introduction to psychology, they said hearing from both sides, keeping an open mind, like keeps you better practice for the future.
Yeah.
All right, next question. What is the first thing you notice about the culture when going abroad?
Maybe food, food, and like body language as well. Food, because everybody loves food, and it's a lot of people's way of creating connection, or just something that's meaningful of gathering, right? Where people gather is normally around food. And in terms of gestures, I remember the first time that I went to Asia. I was traveling to Thailand, and it's a long commute to get there. But we had a layover, and we were there, and like, I think here in the South, right, in San Antonio, we have like space, right? Like normally people give you your personal space. That was not the case. When I'm in the airport, like everybody was really close. Different things like coughing without covering your mouth, and I was just like, oh my goodness, like where, you know, like it. So kind of like gestures, even like eye contact. How some people hold eye contact versus they don't, or look away. Like that distance and proximity of being close to people or not. Those are kind of some of the first things that I always notice when going to a new place.
I think, you know, when I travel back home, it feels like a sense of home, and definitely the food that I miss. And then I haven't traveled to Asia, but I, you know, traveled to Europe, and Europe also kind of feels a bit like home because South Africa has had a lot more European influence than American influence. So it's always like, you know, kind of the little things, cultural things I connect more with Europe and, South Africa, then some of the cultural things, like you said, the body language, the proximity, things like that. So I would agree with Natasha on some of those things.
Yeah. And I think too, because I've visited a lot of different countries, and proximity type of thing is very different depending, and it even differs within that of how people are you, because in Peru people may be close, but it's more of like physical connection, like talking with their hands or like touching people in ways of endearment, or I don't know how to explain it fully, but it's just different depending on where you're at. And so like if you're a person that doesn't like people close to you, right, you're easily going to realize that. Or if you're a person that does like, communicating, maybe it's easy to fall into place within a certain culture because you communicate in similar ways. But yeah, nonverbal communication by far.
That made me think about, but I remember the first time I met my mom's friend, they greeted by like kissing, or not kissing, but kissing on the side. That was something that threw me off for a loop. I was just like, do I do it back, or like what's going on?
Yeah. That's so true.
And let's see. How do you balance traveling with relationships?
Ethan,
I can't answer that. I was married when I moved, so.
I was going to say, Ethan, with this question, are you referring to just relationship maintenance in general of people that are not with you? Or I don't know if anybody wants to expand upon that.
I mean, it could be family, since you're far away from family, or just, intimate relationships, or just friends in total if you're leaving out of the area.
I think being intentional with your communication, and making time to connect, even like how I was saying, when I lived out of the country, I felt isolated sometimes. And it wasn't because I didn't have people around me. I lived with a host family. I had great friends, and what I call family where I was living. But it was different because of like language barriers, cultural differences. So making ways to connect with people on a deeper level, I think helps you with that balance, right? Because even there, it was like, okay, I know that this isn't my like friend that I've known for 10 years, that I have all of these experiences, but I need to build the relationship, right? I need to create that space to have a deeper connection. But yeah, I think trying to find ways to communicate in a space of quality and intention helps you to be able to maintain those relationships better. I would, use like whatever video, I don't remember at that time, like Instagram didn't have videos. I think it was like WhatsApp, using WhatsApp or Facebook to like make phone calls, sending messages. If there was a way for to travel and meet up with the person, like a family member, a friend, I had a group of friends that came to visit me. So just finding ways to be intentional, whatever that may look like, so that you can maintain the connection. It may not be like talking to them all the time, but yeah, being intentional.
I think your point about staying in touch and communicating, and I think that's the advantage with technology today, and even just in the last 10 years, because when I moved to the US, you didn't have smartphones and social media. It was email. That was what you used. But I think now with WhatsApp, with Instagram, with with Zoom and all, there's just, it's so much easier to stay in touch with friends and family.
Yeah. And in the town that I was living in, we didn't have internet access. So I would have to go somewhere to do that, but being intentional, right? Of like, I'm going to spend this time and make some catch-up calls, right? I'm going to go to the internet cabina and, connect and sit there and plan to talk to a few people. But I guess with the pandemic too, the more avenues for internet and communication, but depending on where you're at, you may not have like the internet access, but trying to make time to be able to do that.
Well, I like that, no matter who it is or where it is, you just want to make them feel loved and appreciated and let them know nonetheless that you're thinking of them. Like you said, building or keeping the relationship just going in summary. But yeah. And we'll be opening it up to questions from the members. But
Right,
yeah,
before we get into that, we got a little too excited for the question and answers, so we completely forgot to give our panelists time to present themselves. So if you guys wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about yourselves, maybe talk about your career paths, we'd really love to hear it.
You can go first, Natasha.
Okay. Well, I got my degree, as I stated, in psychology and sociology. And when I graduated, I was looking for work and what I was going to do next. And I decided to do a AmeriCorps program called City Year. And so I did that for a year here in San Antonio. And through that experience, I was like, oh, I'm going to teach, right? So I'm going to go back to school for teaching. And I was like, no, I'm not. And I went ahead and got my master's in counseling while doing some community work and teaching. I taught for a year and then I did some community work. And then after I finished my master's degree, I went into the Peace Corps. And so in the Peace Corps, I worked in a youth development program. And within that, there's so many different parts because whatever you're assigned to, you do more than that particular area. So I did a lot of stuff with the local health posts, with domestic violence and family violence, with women's rights, just a lot of different things based on the needs of my community that I worked within. And then when I returned home, I went back to working within a school environment, within a middle school, and did a lot of community work, again, counseling, social work, those type of things. And then I currently work for a nonprofit, and I am assisting with a citywide initiative here, working on helping make sure that people have the things that they need to be successful. And so that's like the overview of my background in a quick summary. Vanessa, I'll pass it to you.
So as I said, I was trained and licensed as a clinical psychologist in South Africa, and I worked in the psychiatry department of Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital, basically working with in and out patients with a range of mental health issues. It's also a teaching hospital, so worked with nursing and medical students. Then I moved to the States, to Richmond, Virginia in 2002. And then because of visa and licensing and starting the family, I only licensed in 2007. And I had to license as an LPC because you need a PhD in the States to license as a psychologist. Once I was able to start work again, I went into private practice, and that's what I've been in since then. I basically specialize in anxiety, depression, trauma, grief, and any life stress. So I'm certified as an anxiety and trauma specialist. I kind of fell into that because anxiety and depression are kind of the common cold for mental health private practice. And then my approach that I use is pretty much what I call a brain-based approach. So I use the latest neuroscience to really inform and guide how I treat my patients. So that's what I do in a nutshell.
I'm also a licensed counselor as well, and I do private practice on the side as well, outside of my position at the nonprofit. There's just a lot of need for mental health right now in general. So
I completely agree. But looks like we already have a few questions. So the first one is, if you could practice anywhere, where would you go?
ooh, Vanessa.
Oh.
Uh,
Oh.
I feel like there's so many places that I could go. I'd want to be by water with some good music as well. I don't know.
I'm not sure what I would say to that.
I could go to all of the places. That's a tough question. Who asked that question? Alexis? Yeah, I definitely, like, when I think of like living somewhere else, like I'd want water, I'd want like easy access to be able to do things outside and in nature. I'd want there to be good live music, whatever that would be. Out of all of the places that I have visited, Switzerland was my favorite because it was just so fresh and crisp outside is the easiest way to describe it. I don't know what it'd be like to work there because I didn't work there. I went there for about 10 days. And so I can't speak to fully what it would be like to work within that environment, but people were friendly.
I think probably somewhere where there's lots of history. And talking about places I've been that I loved, like Natasha said, Switzerland. Probably I would choose Scotland. We did a road trip in Scotland, and by far is my favorite place I've ever been.
All right, we can move on to the next one. It says, what was your favorite country while working abroad? I know you've only been to a couple, each of you, so I guess it's just, did you have a favorite one?
I've traveled a lot, but I've only worked here in the United States and in Peru. And so I liked them both. I enjoyed what I did in Peru. I, of course, like being here in the US because this is where I've been raised. But yeah, Vanessa, I don't know.
I'm, similar. I've only worked in South Africa and, the US. And I'm not sure which I'd say. I think I worked in two very different environments. I was in a state hospital in South Africa and in private practice. So very different environments, very different groups. You're seeing a lot of mentally ill people in the psychiatry department who are being hospitalized. And private practice, it's a lot of people choosing to look for help. So I loved my time actually at Baragwanath. I loved it. So, but I also love private practice. So it's hard to say.
Okay, the next one is, how does treatment towards women change as you travel to different places? Did you face any discrimination based on your gender?
Yes, at times. If you depend, like Peru, for example, is a very patriarchal country overall, like the system in place, the culture has a lot of machismo, but at the same time, as being an outsider, some of those things weren't always applied to me as a foreigner. But to like building the relationship, as well as setting boundaries and being transparent when somebody does or says something that you feel is inappropriate. Because I can tell you stories and stories, but just a short example of working in the health post, and there was a male doctor, small clinic, all women, one male doctor who was in charge, and he would do very inappropriate things in terms of like things that he would say, things like in terms of close proximity or like leaning over women or just saying things that were inappropriate. And me being a foreigner, it was easier for me to be able to communicate those boundaries versus the women feeling that they could communicate those boundaries within that space. I think too, like I feel like I had different treatment as well, being African American. So many different things in terms of, I will call it curiosity in a lot of ways. And a lot of times people didn't think I was from the United States because I was African American. But then at the same time, they knew the all around. But even from things of like people touching my hair or saying things inappropriately yet again, or not listening or not valuing my opinion as a woman. So those are some of the things that I experienced, but I don't feel like they were huge challenges. It was just about being transparent and creating those relationships of acknowledging that those weren't things that were okay with me.
Oh, sorry.
No, South Africa is also patriarchal. So yes, you know, that is an aspect, but just personally from my experience, I've never really felt oppressed as a woman, even when there's been differential treatment. I just don't feel oppressed as a woman. I feel we've come so far that I don't feel oppressed.
I can agree with that too.
And we had just one more question for Natasha. How long were you in Switzerland?
For 10 days. For 10 days.
A nice little vacation.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So it looks like that's the end of our questions.
I have one more question actually. Do you have any advice, the both of y'all, just any advice for these future psychologists or future counselors or future psychiatrists, whatever it is, our members, just any advice for them at all for their future career, just to get them pumped up or just to keep them on the right track?
Oh.
I think remember why you chose to go into this field. Find your space of passion and show up for the people that you serve in the best capacity that you can. Be open, be willing to learn, be curious. If something is not a space for you, as we're in the mental health field, then change it. You have options. Don't stay in a space where you don't feel like your work is being meaningful to you or the people that you serve, right? Because you don't want to be in a space of burnout where you're working with people who need your help. And so be mindful of that and go out and do great things.
You know, I kind of agree with that. Like, know why you're doing this. I know a lot of people, I think, go into it trying to figure themselves out, and you really need to have yourself figured out before, you try and help other people, because, if you don't manage those boundaries, it really, can lead to burnout. But it is hugely rewarding and fulfilling, and just being able to impact people. And, to one other thing where I was trained to remember that you are the greatest tool you have in treatment. You can learn techniques, all sorts of things, but you are the greatest tool in the therapy process.
I love that. That's so true.
All right, looks like we're just about out of time. We want to thank both our panelists so much for coming tonight.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes, thank you for allowing me to share. I'll give my email too if anybody wants to reach out. I'm more than willing to talk more, but good luck in whatever you guys do.
I had one last question. Is that okay?
Sure.
I was wondering, how do you use neuroscience to treat anxiety, depression, and PTSD? Because I think one of y'all were talking about that.
Yes. Well, we know so much now of what's happening neurobiologically with anxiety, depression, and trauma. So the way I use it is I do a lot of psychoeducation to help the patient understand what's happening in their brain, so to normalize and destigmatize what they're experiencing, and then I help them develop tools to regulate and tolerate distress or any overwhelming emotion like anxiety. So bottom up strategies, which is from the soothing that primitive brain, and then also using cognitive restructuring, the top-down approach to help them shift out of the story they're stuck in.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, if there's no more questions,